Games have the ability to explore many kinds of dynamics and concepts through their mechanics. That is the whole point of the medium, to explore and create dynamics through the game mechanics. There are all sorts of dynamics that games can explore. Today we are going to explore the dynamic of time, and how some games have taken this dynamic and crafted a gameplay experience around exploring the dynamic of time in an interesting way. Without further ado, let's begin. The vast majority of games use time in some way in their design, so before I talk about games that put a unique spin on the concept, I want to talk about the more common uses of time in games, so we can better understand why games focused on time are so special. Firstly, it is important to keep in mind that time in the digital world isn't quite the same as it is in the real world. While in the real world, time is practically infinitely divisible. Technically, there is a shortest observable division of time, known as the Planck second, but for our purposes, this means that time is practically infinitely divisible in the real world. In games, time is split into small lengths of time known as frames. The frame rate is the speed at which the game is updated with new commands. Richard Terrell of Design Oriented uses this concept in his definition of a real-time game. According to Terrell, quote, "We can define real-time in video games as any case where the game state, gameplay challenge, actions, and cause and effect reactions are furthered via some rate of game time. In other words, if a game continues to change regardless of how you play, then the game time is an element outside of your control." End quote. Terrell defines real-time this way, so we can also use it to understand how turn-based games use time. In a real-time game, gameplay actions are carried out as fast as the frame rate allows. But turn-based games pause future gameplay actions for both players until the game is furthered by player actions. Obviously, the nature of these two game types will differ in many ways, but there are also similarities between real-time and turn-based games. For instance, both kinds of games use countdown timers to increase the game's tension and drive the game to an end. There's also a lot of variety in the various different ways that games use timers, so let's take a look at some of the different ways games can use timers and how various timers can differ from one another. The first property of timers I want to look at is the transparency of the timer, or to put it another way, does the player know exactly how much time they have before the end of the timer? In games like XCOM 2 or Team Fortress 2, there are very visible timers the player can see at any time, as opposed to a game like Spelunky, where players know that a ghost will eventually come, but unless they're counting the seconds in their head, the player doesn't know exactly when the ghost will show up. Having a detectable timer will give the player a different kind of tension. Games with detectable timers will become more about a race to the finish before time runs out. On the other hand, the non-detectable timers will create a subtly different kind of tension. I would describe this kind of tension like those Jack-in-the-Box toys. You crank the handle and a slightly disturbing song plays as you turn the crank. You don't know exactly when the box is going to pop, but you know it's going to come eventually. This is of course not the only property timers can have. For instance, consider how malleable a timer is. Or put another way, how much influence do players have over the progression of the timer? Take the train level in A Hat in Time. In this level, players need to reach the end in a short amount of time, but players can pick up these clocks to get more time to finish the level. Thus, A Hat in Time has a malleable timer. Armello is another game with a malleable timer. Every morning, the king takes damage, and the game ends when the king dies. However, players can attack the king, and possibly expedite the king's death. Some games even use the timer's malleability to present an obstacle that isn't always beneficial to the players. In Invisible Ink, there is a timer that counts up every turn, but there are certain player actions that will increase the timer faster, such as killing security guards. Games with malleable timers give the players more control over the progression of time, and makes time itself more of an item that players can interact with, just like any other system in the game. This is not the only way to make time more interactive, but we'll talk about more games that do this later in the video. A fairly uncommon but quite interesting form of timer is the segmented timer. In most games with timers, the timer has two states. The player either finishes their objective in time, or they don't. In XCOM, you either complete your mission in the time limit, or you don't. In Counter-Strike, you either defuse the bomb in time, or you don't. In Spelunky, you either finish the level before the ghost shows up, or you don't. Games with segmented timers blur this line a little bit, and can be in several different states as time goes on. For example, take Invisible Ink. In this game, players explore a randomly generated level, looking for credits, items, and the mission objective. While players are doing these things, they need to pay attention to the security level, the timer system of the game. There are 6 levels of security, and each level is split into 5 sub-levels. Once these 5 sub-levels are filled, the security level is increased, and a new security measure is implemented. These start off quite tame, such as some additional cameras. But as time goes on, security gets tighter and tighter. The security level system is constantly applying pressure to the player, forcing them to make some tough decisions between grabbing some more resources or getting out of there before the security is raised. According to James Lance from the Clay team, our main goal was not to make the alarm levels balanced, nor to make them the most interesting and deep they could possibly be. Instead, our goal was to create movie-like tension and drama above all else. Because our goal for the alarm was primarily experimental, we focused on ramping tension and creating systematic texture rather than ratcheting up the difficulty. It is important to note that the Clay team chose to use a segmented timer because they felt it would better support the theme of a corporation slowly discovering your presence. Not every game would benefit from a segmented timer, but this mechanic fits the theme Invisible Ink is going for very well, and is a unique spin on the passage of time I would like to see implemented in more games. Now that we have talked about a couple of the properties of game timers that designers can tweak to make their timers more interesting, I want to move on and talk about some games that toy with time in interesting ways, starting with Braid. Earlier in the video, I talked about malleability as a property of timers. Braid is a game devoted to exploring the passage of time through its central gameplay mechanics. To see why this is so special, let's look at other popular puzzle games and see how Braid differs from these other games. Portal is a game about traversing and manipulating objects in space using portals. Steven's Sausage Roll is about moving sausages through space to cook the sausages. The Witness is about drawing lines on grids and finding the correct path through space. Infinifactory is about building a factory that manipulates blocks in space to build the correct output. I could keep going like this, but I think you might be picking up on a pattern. I'm certain that not every puzzle game is about the manipulation of objects in space. Even many of these games I just mentioned use the passage of time in some of their solutions. This said though, the vast majority of puzzle games are about the exploration of space. And to reiterate, there is nothing wrong with this, and all 4 of these games have completely different gameplay using wildly different mechanics. That said, one of the reasons why Braid is so special is because it is a direct and thorough exploration of time, as well as space. In Braid, players have completely and total control over the passage of time and are able to rewind it as much as they please. Each world is an exploration of the ramifications of such a power, presenting a completely new twist in each world. In the first world, all of the puzzles are possible to solve without using your rewind powers at all, and are there to show you the basics of movement and some of the puzzle elements that will be used later in the game. Even though players aren't required to use their rewind abilities, this world features many puzzle pieces that will be much easier to grab by rewinding time to avoid making mistakes, with knowledge of what will happen in the future. World 2 is where the mechanics that really start messing with time come into play. Green particles can be found on many of the objects in World 2 and beyond. and these particles mean that the object cannot be reversed with your time-altering abilities. This is where the time ability moves away from being a mechanic that lets the player fix their past mistakes, and becomes a mechanic that the players need to use to manipulate an object's position throughout the timeline. Since this ability now affects objects in different ways, the player's main ability can now be used to change the timeline in ways that aren't possible with our current understanding of how time works. World 3 completely changes the way that time progresses once again. Instead of time passing in real time moves forward when the player moves forward, and backward when the player moves backward. Once again, the concept of time is completely different from in our world, and these levels are about exploring the consequences of the system of time. World 4 is about two different timelines affecting each other, which obviously isn't how time works in our world, but it is another example of a malleable timeline of events that the player can enact change upon through their abilities. Finally, in World 5, the player is given a ring, which slows down the passage of time for nearby objects, and once again is another way that the player can manipulate the passage of time to solve puzzles. Each chapter, with the possible exception of the first, requires the player to understand the rules of time and then manipulate them in the same way that players need to manipulate the rules of space in other puzzle games. This is one of the reasons why Braid is one of the most interesting explorations of time gaming can offer. While Braid is one of the best explorations of time in puzzle games, there are a myriad of other games that explore time in other genres. So let's move on and talk about one of the most interesting explorations of time found in a first-person shooter. I am of course referring to SUPERHOT, the game where time only moves when you do. Many first-person shooters use time pressure and reaction time as part of the core gameplay. This isn't to say that first-person shooter games are mindless, but it is an undeniable fact that if there were two tactically even-matched players in a 1v1 game, the player with faster reflexes is going to have the advantage. SUPERHOT is a game designed around this concept, because in SUPERHOT, time only moves when you do, and this means that reflexes don't really matter. This moves the focus of the game away from the reflex side of first-person shooters, and puts that focus on other aspects of the game. In an interview with Gamasutra, Peter Iwanicki talks about how SUPERHOT evolved from its early development. The game started being more focused on shooting, but when we discovered the possibilities, it gravitated towards a more slow-motion ballet of punches, grabbing items around you, throwing them, dodging bullets. It lets you play so much more expressively. It's much deeper in tiny procedural movement that force you to improvise. Since the player has been given power over time, the game requires the player to show mastery with its use. If the player makes one mistake, they are killed and sent to the beginning of the level. Fortunately, the levels are short and the player respawns quickly, so not much progress is lost. All of these factors contribute to make SUPERHOT an interesting exploration of the ramifications of this time-altering ability. Both Braid and SUPERHOT grant the player amazing time-altering abilities, and expect them to use these abilities to perform feats not possible to you or me. But this is not the only way that a game can explore time. Let's take a look at Crypt of the Necrodancer, a game about music, and by extension, time. Of all the roguelikes I have played, Crypt of the Necrodancer uses the constant pressure of time to force the player forward better than any other roguelike I have played. In Spelunky, players need to go somewhat quickly to make sure that they don't die to the ghost, but the player can still go pretty slowly, taking their time to make sure they don't take any careless damage. In Faster Than Light, on a global level, the main system pushing the player forward is the Rebel fleet, and unless the player is really unlucky, they will be able to avoid it quite handily. Sure, the player is pushed forward in both of these games, but the player controls the speed that they move forward to a greater extent, which can lead to players taking their time and making the best plays possible. Enter Crypt of the Necrodancer. For those of you who haven't played this game, Crypt of the Necrodancer is a roguelike that borrows from the old school style of roguelike design that existed before games like Spelunky completely revolutionized the roguelike genre. The game brings back the top-down view of randomly generated dungeons with turn-based combat. But notably, Crypt makes one change that makes time way more interesting and important than in old-school roguelikes. The central mechanic in Crypt of the Necrodancer is this. The player needs to move to the beat of the song playing in the background. If the player moves too soon or too late, they lose their coin combo, which means that the player gets less money for defeating enemies, which the player needs to get good equipment. One interesting thing about this system is how the game twists its own system of time. Just like later levels of platformers, which increase the difficulty by lengthening the spaces between platforms, Crypt of the Necrodancer has some knobs it can manipulate to increase the difficulty as the game progresses. Aside from introducing more difficult enemies, the game also changes the background music on every level, which gets faster and faster as the game progresses, forcing the player to make decisions more quickly while dealing with the aforementioned more difficult enemies. But the game doesn't stop there, and the game plays with time in other ways as well. In one of the more interesting boss fights, the background song doesn't have a steady beat like the rest of the game. Instead, there are some pauses that last longer than others. So the player needs to keep these in mind so as to not rush and lose their combo. The game also has some traps that will slightly change the speed of the song, possibly throwing the player off beat. This is a kind of trap that only really works in Crypt of the Necrodancer. Sure, there are spike and bomb traps that aren't all that uncommon in dungeon crawlers, but the tempo trap of Crypt of the Necrodancer is unique because it doesn't directly affect the player through damage or some direct debuff. Instead, the tempo trap changes the internal clock of the game, using the game's time against the player. Of course, not everything is trying to hurt the player, and the player can take advantage of the game's time-based nature as well. Some shrines explore the way time works in the game. For instance, there is the Shrine of Rhythm, which gives the player obsidian items. These items change in effectiveness depending on the player's current multiplier. If the player does well and keeps moving to the beat of the song, these items are some of the best in the game. But if the player misses a beat, these items become significantly less powerful. This ties into the downside of the Rhythm Shrine. Once the shrine is activated, every 8th beat is removed, similar to the King Konga boss fight. This slight change completely changes the game and puts the player to the test. The items that the player receives are designed to be effective when the player doesn't miss a beat, but the downside makes it much harder not to miss a beat. Finally, the game also has an item that directly ties into the beat system of the game. If the player uses a pacemaker, they will be freed from the shackles of time and can move at their own pace for a short time before needing to move on at the normal pace. The final game I want to talk about is another real-time game, but this game handles its real-time in a different way than most. This game is Subterfuge. When you think of a real-time strategy game, you probably think of something like StarCraft or Tooth and Tail. These games take place in real time, but only take about an hour or less to play. Subterfuge, on the other hand, was designed to be played over the course of a week. While the more traditional real-time strategy games require a lot of skill and study to play competitively, they also give advantages to the player who can perform quickly and react to attacks. Since Subterfuge has slowed the pace of the game way down, it has allowed the developers to focus on different parts of the game. For example, Since the players have a lot more time to think while performing their actions, diplomacy can become much more important than it is in a normal real-time strategy game. It is important to note that another game has tried this long-form real-time strategy game idea before. This game is Neptune's Pride. However, the developers Noel Lopez and Ron Carmel made some changes to keep Subterfuge from falling into the same pit traps that Neptune's Pride fell into. Perhaps the largest of these changes is the time machine. In Neptune's Pride, players can only take actions when they're logged on. This meant that sometimes players would have to play at inconvenient hours in order to play well. This might involve waking up in the middle of the night, or rushing through other important tasks during the day to play well. Subterfuge devised a brilliant solution to this problem through the use of its time machine. Using the time machine, players can queue actions to happen in the future, even if they aren't logged on at the time. This means that players can plan out their movement whenever it is convenient for them to do so, making the game much more accessible to people who would like to play. Time is an innate property of the universe. It is relative, and it is constantly moving forward. Almost every game uses time in some way, but some games go above and beyond to toy with time as a concept, and I hope that I've shown you that time is an aspect of design games can explore even if they aren't about time travel. Perhaps in the future I will make another video similar to this one, analyzing how some games play with a unique gameplay dynamic. Feel free to leave any feedback or suggestions in the comments, since that is how these videos will continue to improve and get better. Feel free to like and subscribe as well. Until next time, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.